When Blazing Saddles galloped into theaters in 1974, it wasn't just another Western. It was a full-blown cultural explosion. Mel Brooks unleashed a film so outrageous, so daring, and so unapologetically offensive, it left audiences howling and Hollywood execs scrambling. But behind the fart jokes, racial satire, and fourth-wall breaks lies a treasure trove of behind-the-scenes madness that most fans have never heard. From cast firings and near lawsuits to secret rewrites and roles almost played by legends like John Wayne and Richard Pryor, this is the wild, unfiltered truth about a film that redefined comedy and nearly broke the rules doing it. From Tex-Ex to Blazing Saddles. Before the world knew it as Blazing Saddles, this culture-shattering comedy had a far more radical name: Tex-Ex. The working title was a bold wink to Malcolm X, hinting at a revolutionary twist to the Western genre. A black sheriff arriving in an all-white frontier town. At the time, that was more than edgy. It was practically career suicide. Writer Andrew Bergman wasn't trying to make a safe comedy. He was targeting the lies Hollywood had told for decades. His early script painted the Wild West not as a land of heroes, but a backdrop for systemic racism, absurd traditions, and unchecked privilege. And at the center of it all, a whip-smart black man who refuses to play by the rules. Warner Brothers wasn't laughing. The studio balked at the implications of Tex-Ex. They feared boycotts, backlash, and controversy, so the name changed. The content didn't. When Mel Brooks came aboard, he didn't just preserve the core satire, he supercharged it. The new title, Blazing Saddles, was designed to distract, a vague Western throwback that didn't immediately signal what the audience was about to experience. But beneath the comedic chaos, Blazing Saddles remained a political powder keg. Brooks saw the brilliance in making audiences laugh at their own biases, forcing a reckoning through slapstick. The jokes weren't just for giggles. They were loaded, meant to explode centuries of myth-making in American storytelling. The title may have shifted, but make no mistake, Tex-Ex lived on in every racist townsperson, every punchline soaked in irony, and every blazing moment that made people uncomfortable. It wasn't just a title change, it was a sleight of hand. And by the time audiences figured out what they were really watching, the revolution had already begun. Alan Arkin and James Earl Jones almost led long before Mel Brooks ever yelled, "Cut!" There was a very different version of Blazing Saddles in the works. A version starring James Earl Jones as the Black Sheriff and Alan Arkin directing. It was bold. It was dramatic. And it wasn't funny. On paper, it looked promising. Jones, with his thunderous voice and Shakespearean gravitas, could have brought real weight to the role of Sheriff Bart. Arkin, fresh off critical acclaim, was a clever director with a flair for character. But, when it came to tone, they were mismatched from the start. Jones wasn't a comic actor. His strength lay in power, not punchlines. And Arkin's vision leaned more toward a grounded social drama with satirical moments, not the anarchic genre explosion that Blazing Saddles would eventually become. Meetings were tense. Rewrites stalled. The production lost momentum. Eventually, Warner Brothers pulled the plug. For a moment, it looked like the project would die in development hell. But then, in a move that changed comedy history, Mel Brooks stepped in. Brooks saw something no one else did. This story needed to be louder, cruder, faster, and funnier. He tossed the serious tone, rewrote huge chunks of the script, and reframed the film as a slapstick assault on racism, Hollywood, and tradition itself. Jones was out. Cleavon Little would later step into the lead, and Arkin's loss became Brooks's gain. It's a reminder of how close we came to a very different movie. A version that might have been respected, but not beloved. That might have earned praise, but not gut-busting laughter. Because Blazing Saddles wasn't meant to whisper its message. It was meant to scream it through a megaphone while falling off a horse. Mel Brooks at a low point. When Mel Brooks took over Blazing Saddles, he wasn't the legend we know today. In fact, he was in the worst creative and financial slump of his career. His last film had tanked. Studios had stopped calling. And at home, he had a newborn baby and a growing pile of bills. Brooks later admitted, "I was desperate. I needed a hit. I needed a job." So when the Tex-Ex script came across his desk, he didn't grab it out of passion. He grabbed it out of panic. But once he dove in, something unexpected happened. The more he rewrote it, the more he saw the potential, not just to make people laugh, but to burn down Hollywood's fake history. Suddenly, this wasn't just a paycheck. It was a chance to say something real. He poured himself into the script, fearlessly, ruthlessly, personally. He rewrote characters, inserted gags, shoved musical numbers into saloon brawls. At one point, Brooks said, "I wanted to make the most offensive, most hilarious movie anyone had ever seen." And that wasn't hyperbole. It was his mission. Brooks fought with executives. He argued over casting. He refused to cut racial slurs, not because he enjoyed them, but because sanitizing them would make the film dishonest. By the time cameras rolled, Brooks had turned a dead-end project into a cultural firestorm waiting to ignite. And he knew it might be his last chance. Turns out, it wasn't the end of his career. It was the beginning of a legend. Blazing Saddles didn't just save Mel Brooks, it transformed him into the godfather of political comedy. And to think, it all started with a man backed into a corner. Mayhem in the writing room. If you think Blazing Saddles feels chaotic, try spending a day in the room where it was written. The writing team, Mel Brooks, Richard Pryor, Andrew Bergman, Norman Steinberg, and Alan Yuger, was a powder keg of comedic brilliance. And it exploded daily. The first draft? A whopping 412 pages, a surreal epic of race, cowboys, and fart jokes that sprawled like the Wild West itself. There were no boundaries, no polite rules, just constant debates, joke pitching, and caffeinated arguments. They worked through the night. They rewrote entire acts in a day. They screamed at each other over the placement of a burp. And it was genius. Richard Pryor brought edge and realism. Brooks brought absurdity. Bergman brought structure. Together, they created a storm of satire so sharp, so raw, it could only have come from chaos. The writers cut it down, eventually landing on a 275-page script, still huge, but pulsing with energy. And every joke, every slur, every fart was there on purpose. Brooks said later, "The writing room was a battlefield, but we were fighting to tell the truth." And that's exactly what they did, while laughing the whole time. Don't write a polite script. Inside the writing room, one sign kept everyone honest. Don't write a polite script. It was more than a motto. It was Mel Brooks's commandment. From the start, Brooks told his team, if a joke makes you hesitate, put it in. If it offends someone, even better. Because Blazing Saddles wasn't made to play nice. It was made to punch through American hypocrisy and keep punching. No target was off limits. Racism, colonialism, gun culture, the Hollywood system, the audience themselves. Pryor, who helped write some of the most biting scenes, insisted they leave the N-word in. Not to shock, but to confront. "If we sugarcoat it," he said, "we lose the point." And Brooks agreed. They made the governor a pervert, the villain a metrosexual, the cowboys jazz fans, and the sheriff a black man smarter than everyone in town. Every joke was a dagger. Every fart was a protest. When execs begged Brooks to cut the most problematic material, he refused. He told them, "If we take that out, we lose the truth." And that's why Blazing Saddles endures. Not because it was safe, but because it wasn't. Richard Pryor's hidden influence. When people talk about Blazing Saddles, they often forget the invisible hand behind its sharpest punches, Richard Pryor. Originally, he wasn't just a writer. He was Mel Brooks's first choice to star as Sheriff Bart. It made perfect sense. Pryor was raw, brilliant, unapologetic. But Warner Brothers disagreed. They feared his off-stage reputation, drug use, legal troubles, and pulled the plug. Brooks was furious, but he wasn't letting Pryor go that easily. Instead, he brought him on as a lead writer, a voice behind the camera who would help give the film its explosive edge. Pryor didn't just write jokes. He sharpened the satire. He demanded the N-word stay in, not for shock value, but to show the ugliness of racism in its rawest form. "Take it out," he warned, "and you're just making another fairy tale." It was Pryor who pushed for Cleavon Little to take the lead role. Brooks trusted him, and Little delivered a performance full of charisma, defiance, and bite. But Pryor's fingerprints were everywhere, from the structure of the jokes to the rhythms of the dialogue. That casual, cutting wit? Pure Pryor. Though he never appeared on screen, his influence remains one of the most important parts of the film. Without him, Blazing Saddles would have been funny, but it might not have been revolutionary. The Waco Kid casting nightmare. The role of the Waco Kid, an ex-gunslinger with a shaky hand and a sharper mind, was meant to be comedy gold. But before Gene Wilder brought it to life, the production nearly imploded over a casting disaster. The first choice? Gig Young, an Oscar winner with a serious drinking problem. Brooks believed Young's weary look and weathered charm could give the Waco Kid real pathos. But on his very first day of filming, disaster struck. Mid-scene, Young began sweating uncontrollably, slurring his lines. Then he vomited, right there on set. Production was shut down. Young was fired on the spot, and the fallout was immediate. A lawsuit, delays, and rising studio panic. Brooks was desperate. He called Gene Wilder, not just a friend, but a trusted collaborator from the producers and Young Frankenstein. Wilder read the script and said yes within 24 hours. And just like that, the chemistry changed. Wilder's calm, deadpan delivery was the perfect counterbalance to the madness around him. He gave the Waco Kid soul, pain, and a smirk that became iconic. That casting pivot didn't just save the film, it made it immortal. John Wayne was almost in it. It sounds like a joke, but it's absolutely true. John Wayne, the Duke himself, almost made a cameo in Blazing Saddles. Mel Brooks, always one to mix reverence with ridicule, sent Wayne the script, hoping he'd appear in the film as a sly nod to the genre he helped define. Wayne read it. He laughed. He called Brooks. Then he politely declined. "I can't do this movie," he said. "It's too dirty for my image, but I'll be the first in line to see it." It was a near miss that still haunts fans of the film. Wayne's appearance would have been the ultimate inside joke, a cowboy god blessing a movie that gleefully tore down the very myths he helped build. Brooks considered Dan Dailey and others, but nothing matched the cultural punch that Wayne could have delivered. And yet, the Duke's response showed respect. He knew what Brooks was doing. He even admired it. But his legacy, tough, clean-cut, patriotic, couldn't risk being tied to a film full of fart jokes and racial slurs. Still, his stamp of approval mattered. When a man like John Wayne says he's first in line, it means you're doing something right, even if you're blowing up his genre. The studio screening that bombed, you'd think a comedy like Blazing Saddles would kill at its first screening. It didn't. In fact, the very first studio screening bombed so hard, Warner Brothers executives considered pulling the plug. It was a disaster. Silence. No laughs. Executives stared in stunned horror. One called it an insult to comedy. Another demanded Mel Brooks cut every racial slur, every fart joke, and the infamous bean scene. Brooks walked out and didn't cut a thing. Instead, he scheduled a second screening. This time, he filled the room with janitors, assistants, secretaries, real people, not studio suits. And what happened next changed everything. The room erupted. Laughter shook the walls. Applause, cheers, even tears from laughing too hard. That crowd didn't just like the film. They adored it. Suddenly, Warner Brothers had a hit on their hands, and Brooks had leverage. That second screening became the stuff of legend. It proved what Brooks always believed. Truth in comedy doesn't come from executives. It comes from the audience. And once the real people spoke, the studio had no choice but to listen. Limited launch, massive payoff. When Blazing Saddles was finally greenlit for release in 1974, Warner Bros. Wasn't betting on a hit. They were bracing for disaster. The film had already caused ripples in the studio, with executives balking at its vulgarity, racial slurs, and genre-defying absurdity. They had no idea how to market it. So they decided not to. There was no national ad campaign, no late-night promotional blitz, no trailers during primetime TV. The film opened quietly in just 3 cities: New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. It was a strategic soft launch, more of a controlled experiment than a confident premiere. Internally, many at the studio predicted it would flame out after a short, controversial run. But then, the audience spoke, and they didn't whisper. They roared. Word of mouth ignited like a prairie fire. People didn't just laugh. They screamed, gasped, and repeated every line as if it were gospel. "Where the white women at? Badges? We don't need no stinkin' badges. It's 2A! It's 2A!" The quotes spread like wildfire. Viewers returned for second, third, even fourth showings. They brought friends, family, co-workers. Entire blocks of theaters would erupt in synchronized laughter at the now iconic campfire fart scene. Suburban cinemas overflowed. Urban movie houses stayed packed for weeks. Some theaters had to add extra showtimes just to meet demand. What began as a hesitant, low-risk release suddenly became a grassroots comedy movement. The numbers? A staggering $100 million at the domestic box office. On a modest $2.6 million budget, that return made Blazing Saddles one of the most profitable comedies in Warner Brothers. entire history. It also became a case study in how the industry's elite could completely misread what the public actually wanted. The people weren't clamoring for polished, family-safe entertainment. They wanted edge. They wanted truth wrapped in chaos. And most of all, they wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, even the ugly parts. Blazing Saddles didn't just outperform expectations, it exploded them. It proved once and for all that a well-aimed fart joke, when delivered with purpose and timing, could shake Hollywood to its core. Hidden meanings in names and cameos. On the surface, Blazing Saddles was chaos. But under the madness, meticulous mischief. Mel Brooks laced the film with layers of in-jokes, name gags, and cultural Easter eggs that only the sharpest fans ever caught. Take Governor Lepetomane, Brooks's own role. The name wasn't random. It referenced a real 19th-century French performer famous for his flatulence. Yep, Joseph Pujol, stage name Le Pétoman, made a living playing musical notes with his behind. Brooks loved the absurdity and baked it into the movie, matching the now infamous bean campfire scene. Brooks didn't stop there. He gave himself 4 cameos, each more ridiculous than the last. The corrupt governor, an Indian chief speaking Yiddish, a rowdy, drunk heckler, and even the voice of the horse-punching thug. It was a masterclass in blending self-parody with absurdist commentary. Then came the Count Basie cameo. In what should have been a dusty Old West scene, the camera pans to a full jazz orchestra playing April in Paris, in the middle of the desert, in 1874. No explanation, just genius. Brooks called it the funniest anachronism I ever wrote. The moment made it clear. This wasn't your granddad's Western. It was a cultural bomb with a brass section. Even the supporting characters had jokes baked into their names. Hedley Lamar, the oily villain, was a thinly veiled jab at actress Hedy Lamarr. The joke became so recurrent, it triggered a real lawsuit. But more on that later. These weren't just random gags. They were intentional disruptions of genre, flipping the viewer's expectations at every turn. Every Yiddish line, every misplaced song, every name pun. Brooks turned the entire Western mythos into a playground. And for fans paying close attention, it meant that Blazing Saddles didn't just mock Hollywood, it outsmarted it. Madeline Kahn and Cloris Leachman. Audition Tales, Blazing Saddles wasn't just a Mel Brooks masterclass in absurdity, it was a showcase for 2 of the greatest comedic women ever to grace the screen. Madeline Kahn and Cloris Leachman. Their performances helped elevate the film from fart joke farce to a razor-sharp satire filled with subversive brilliance. But the way they landed their roles? Pure showbiz chaos. Madeline Kahn auditioned for the role of Lily von Stupp, the weary cabaret singer modeled after Marlene Dietrich. But instead of reading her lines meekly or asking questions about the part, she walked into the room and became Lily. With a world-weary sigh, a deadpan pout, and a thick faux German accent, she purred her lines with such calculated laziness that Brooks nearly fell out of his chair laughing. There was one catch, though. Kahn had a strict no-touching rule. No one was allowed to touch her during filming. But instead of being a problem, it became comedy gold. Brooks turned it into a running gag, with Lily recoiling dramatically every time someone came too close. The joke wasn't in the script. It was born from Kahn's real boundary, proof that comedy can come from constraint, not just chaos. Brooks later said, "She had the timing of a jazz trumpet and the instincts of a jungle cat." Then there was Cloris Leachman, gunning for the bizarre role of Frau Blücher, the grim, glue-faced housekeeper whose very name made horses scream. Her first audition? Too safe, too polite. Brooks pushed her, and Leachman, never one to back down, pushed right back. Their rehearsal clashes were electric. She brought unpredictable weirdness to a role that, on paper, could have been forgettable. That risk paid off. Leachman made Frau Blücher iconic, all with a deadpan stare, stiff posture, and a weird erotic energy that kept the audience guessing. Both actresses weren't just scene stealers, they were scene reinventions. Kahn earned an Oscar nomination. Leachman turned a background role into comedic legend. In a film full of gun-toting cowboys and farting frontiersmen, it was two fearless women who left the biggest impression and proved that Brooksian comedy needed brilliant, bold actresses just as much as it needed chaos. When controversy became legacy. If any film ever walked the razor-thin line between banned and beloved, it's Blazing Saddles. From the moment it hit theaters in 1974, it wasn't just a movie. It was a cultural firestorm dressed as a slapstick western. And nearly 50 years later, it's still igniting debate. Shortly after its release, the first legal tremor hit. Cloris Leachman, fiercely protective of Hollywood legacy, reportedly threatened legal action over the film's villain, Hedy Lamarr, believing it insulted her friend, the iconic Hedy Lamarr. The joke, built on a mispronunciation gag, was settled behind closed doors, but it marked the beginning of a deeper public reckoning. The real fuel for controversy, though, was language. The film's frequent use of racial slurs, especially the N-word, was shocking even in the 1970s. But unlike other films of its time, Brooks used these words as satirical weapons, not punchlines. He wasn't endorsing racism, he was skewering it. Still, many viewers, especially in recent years, have struggled with the film's tone. By 2024, Blazing Saddles was accompanied by content warnings on streaming platforms like Max, prompting heated arguments about censorship, intent, and historical context. A new generation labeled the film problematic. Mel Brooks, never shy, clapped back. Political correctness is death to comedy. And yet, the culture didn't cancel him. It canonized him. The American Film Institute listed it among the top 10 comedies of all time. The Library of Congress enshrined it in the National Film Registry, declaring it culturally significant. Because underneath the fart jokes and fourth-wall breaks was a filmmaker daring to say, "This country has a problem, and we're going to laugh our way right into its rotten heart." Blazing Saddles doesn't just hold up, it punches up. At racism, at Hollywood, at sanitized Americana. In a world increasingly afraid of offense, it remains one of the last truly fearless comedies. Messy, vulgar, brilliant, and unforgettable. Because sometimes, the only way to tell the truth is to blow up the stage and let the audience laugh through the wreckage. Nearly 50 years later, Blazing Saddles still sparks debate, laughter, and awe. It wasn't just a comedy. It was a cinematic cannonball fired at the boundaries of taste. And the stories behind it? Just as wild as what made it to screen. Because sometimes, the funniest films come from the most fearless chaos.